All right, so today we're going to do something pretty interesting. We're going back to 2016,
Okay.
the year Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election.
Oh.
We've got a whole bunch of articles and reports here, but we're not just going to, rehash the news. We want to go deeper
Right.
and figure out what really swung the election, what it tells us about the American political scene, kind of like a political autopsy, figuring out the hidden causes of this big shock.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it because a lot of people, just saw this as a total shock.
Right.
But when you look closer, you start to see how the pieces fit together.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So where do we even begin dissecting this? What's the biggest piece of the puzzle that stands out to you?
Well, one of the biggest things that people miss is how Trump did in the Midwest. He managed to break through what was supposed to be Hillary Clinton's firewall.
Right.
In states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
These are states that voted Democrat for president for decades.
Right. The blue wall crumbled, and those wins in the Midwest really put him over the top.
Right.
But he didn't win those states by a lot, did he?
No, not at all. That's what makes it so interesting. The margins were tiny, like a few thousand votes in some cases.
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah.
A few thousand people deciding the fate of a nation. It really shows how much every single vote matters,
Absolutely.
especially in those swing states.
And it shows how strategic the Trump campaign was, targeting certain people and areas. But before we get into that, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the Electoral College.
Yeah, the whole Electoral College versus popular vote debate. Just to remind everyone, Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes.
Right.
But Trump became president. How's that even possible?
Well, it's the system itself. The U.S. president isn't chosen directly by the people. It's through the Electoral College. Each state gets a certain number of votes based on population.
Right.
And whoever wins the most electoral votes wins the presidency.
So even though more people overall voted for Clinton, Trump won because he got more electoral votes by winning those key states,
Yeah.
even by small margins. Makes you wonder what would have happened if it was just based on the popular vote.
It definitely raises questions about the Electoral College. But for our deep dive today, it's important to see how the system helped Trump win. It wasn't just luck, it was strategy, taking advantage of how American elections work.
Okay, so we've got this Midwest upset
Yeah.
and the Electoral College. What else caused this political earthquake? Our sources point to a few things.
One of the biggest was that people were just fed up. It wasn't just the economy, though, that played a part.
Right.
There was this feeling that the system wasn't working for regular people.
He played the outsider card really well. He was the anti-establishment candidate. And people who felt ignored by the politicians really connected with that message.
Exactly. And his way of talking, even though it was divisive, it tapped into this anger and resentment. He offered simple solutions to complicated problems, drain the swamp, make America great again.
And don't forget social media. Trump was a master at using Twitter to get around the regular media and control the story.
Absolutely. Social media was huge in this election. Trump used it to talk directly to voters, attack his opponents, all without being fact-checked.
Right.
Which was unusual.
It was like having his own personal megaphone 24/7. But that brings up another issue, misinformation and fake news,
Yeah.
especially on social media.
Yeah.
Our sources say this really swayed people.
Yeah, that's a big one. The 2016 election saw a ton of false information online, and it was often targeted at certain groups with specific messages.
It's like people were living in completely different realities, all reinforcing what they already believed. No wonder the country felt so divided.
Exactly, and this problem of online misinformation echo chambers.
Right.
It's something we're still dealing with.
So we've got economic worries, people disillusioned with the establishment, the power of social media, and the spread of misinformation. It all came together at the same time, like a perfect storm.
That's a great way to put it. It wasn't just one thing. It was everything happening at once. That led to this unexpected result.
There's more to the story, right?
Yeah.
The sense that America was adrift, no clear leader on the world stage.
Yes, that's another key theme. That there was a leadership vacuum in U.S. foreign policy. And it goes back further than just Obama.
So it's not just Trump being unique. He was taking advantage of something that had been building for a while.
Exactly. If we look at past presidents, there was criticism of decisions being made too quickly, lack of a clear vision, and inconsistency in foreign policy.
So it seems like people were already looking for a leader who would be strong on the world stage.
Yeah.
Someone who would put America first.
Exactly. And Trump, with his simple, direct way of talking, he tapped into that. He presented himself as the strong leader America needed, even if his ways were different.
It's fascinating how this idea of leadership, or the lack of it, played such a big role in setting the stage for Trump's win.
Uh-huh.
But there's another layer to this. Our sources also talk about how Biden's own missteps might have added to this problem.
Yes, that's where we shift to the current administration and how some of the things Biden has done or hasn't done might be feeding into this same idea of ineffective leadership.
Okay, let's get specific. What examples are we talking about?
Well, our sources mention everything, from public gaffes and mixing up places to jokes that didn't land right, and even looking confused during speeches.
Yeah.
Like that time he mixed up the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team with the black and tans, a British military unit known for being brutal during the Irish War of Independence.
Oh, yeah. That was a big historical mistake.
Mm.
And then there were times when he seemed to forget things or lose his train of thought during speeches.
Exactly. And while these might seem like small things on their own, when they
Yeah.
happen a lot, they start to create a bigger problem.
It's like each little slip-up adds to the others, creating this image of weakness or being incompetent, even if it's not completely true.
Yeah.
And when you add those communication issues to the criticisms of his policies, like the Afghanistan withdrawal and how he's dealt with China and Russia,
Mhm.
it makes his leadership look even more complicated.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the heart of our deep dive, this problem of leadership in the U.S. It's not just about one person or one party. It's bigger than that. American leadership has been seen as inconsistent, without a clear vision, not effective.
It's like this weakness that both Trump and maybe others can use to their advantage. That's a scary thought.
It is, and it makes us ask, what kind of leadership does America need in a world that's changing so fast?
Right.
What are voters looking for? And can our political system even produce leaders who can handle the challenges we're facing?
We've covered so much already in this first part. The Midwest upset the Electoral College, social media leadership in crisis. It's a lot to think about.
It is. But it's important to really grapple with all of this if we want to understand not just the 2016 election,
Right.
but where American politics is headed.
Absolutely. So before we move on to the next part,
Mhm.
is there one thing you want our listener to really consider?
I think the biggest takeaway is that elections aren't just about personalities or policies. They're about stories, emotions, and the weak spots in a society. And those weak spots can be taken advantage of, like we saw in 2016.
So it's not just about what happened in the past, but about what we can learn from it for today and the future.
Exactly. And that's what we'll dig into in the next part. We'll look at the specific things Trump did, how he targeted certain groups of people, and what his win really means in the long run. Welcome back to our deep dive looking at what led to Donald Trump's win in 2016. In part one, we talked about how this idea of weak leadership people being unhappy and the way Trump used social media set the stage for his victory.
Right.
Now let's zoom in a bit and look at how his campaign actually got those key swing states.
Okay, so we're going from the big picture to the actual tactics.
Exactly. And one of the things they did really well was targeting specific groups of voters,
Got it.
especially white working-class voters, in those Rust Belt states that had been struggling economically.
You're talking about places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin.
Exactly. Places that had always voted Democrat but flipped to Trump.
Right.
These were areas where factories closed down, communities were hurting, people felt forgotten by the politicians. Trump really zeroed in on that feeling of economic anxiety.
He promised to bring jobs back, renegotiate trade deals,
Yeah.
put America first. It was a message that really hit home for those voters who felt left behind by globalization and the political elite.
Exactly. And if you look at the data from those states, you see a real shift in how white voters without college degrees voted. They were drawn to Trump's message, this idea of shaking things up, fighting for the forgotten man.
He made himself the champion of the working class, someone who understood their struggles and would fight for them. And he didn't shy away from strong language, even if it was divisive.
His rhetoric really tapped into cultural anxieties, too,
Right.
especially about immigration and national identity. He painted this picture of America under threat, losing its values, its place in the world.
Right. He promised to build a wall. Ban Muslims, put America first. These were controversial policies, to say the least.
Yeah.
But they appealed to a part of the population that felt threatened by cultural change and this perceived loss of national identity.
It's important to remember that while economic anxiety was a big factor, it wasn't the only one. Trump also appealed to this sense of nostalgia, a longing for a simpler time, when America seemed stronger, more unified.
Right. It was a message that really resonated in those Rust Belt communities that had seen their industries disappear, their way of life disrupted. They saw Trump as someone who could bring back those good old days.
And he used social media to reinforce that message. He went around the traditional media, controlled the narrative, and connected directly with voters on platforms like Twitter.
It was like he had his own personal news channel, broadcasting 24/7.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to attack his opponents, spread misinformation, even promote conspiracy theories.
His use of social media was definitely different,
Right.
but it was really effective. He knew how to make simple, memorable slogans. He knew how to get people angry and talking, which kept him in the news all the time.
And we can't forget about the misinformation and fake news we talked about in part 1.
Yeah.
Our sources say that this really shaped how people saw the 2016 election.
Absolutely. The spread of false or misleading information online through social media was something we hadn't seen before.
Right.
Fake news articles, conspiracy theories, manipulated images all over the place. And they were often targeted at specific groups, designed to cause trouble and influence how people voted.
It's almost like people were being bombarded with different versions of reality,
Right.
each one reinforcing their own biases, making it harder to tell what was true and what wasn't.
Exactly. And that led to a more divided electorate,
Right.
where people didn't trust the usual sources of information and were more likely to believe messages that played on their emotions, even if those messages weren't true.
It was the perfect environment for someone like Trump, who was great at using people's fears and anxieties and offering simple but often misleading solutions.
He understood how to use the way social media works to his advantage, to get his message in front of the right people at the right time. And he wasn't limited by the usual rules of truth or accuracy.
It was a whole new way of running a campaign, one that relied on emotional appeals, divisive rhetoric, and manipulating online information. And it worked.
It did, and it's something that other campaigns have studied and tried to copy since then, which makes you wonder, has the 2016 election changed how campaigns are run forever?
That's a pretty scary thought. It feels like we're in a whole new world of politics, where the old rules don't apply anymore, and it's harder than ever to tell what's true and what's not.
It's definitely a different landscape now than it was just a few years ago, and understanding how Trump's campaign worked, the things they did, and the weaknesses they used is really important if we want to figure out this new reality.
Okay, so we've gone from these big ideas of leadership and discontent to a closer look at what actually got Trump elected. We've seen how he targeted certain voters, how he used social media, and how he benefited from a climate of misinformation. What's next in our deep dive? Where do we go from here?
Now we need to look at what happened after the 2016 election. What were the long-term effects of this political earthquake? How did it change American politics? And what lessons can we learn from all of this as we move forward?
So we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Donald Trump's 2016 victory. We've looked at what got him to the White House, how his campaign worked, and what weaknesses they used. Now it's time to talk about the aftermath, what happened after this election that's still affecting America today.
It's important to remember that the 2016 election wasn't just a one-time thing. It was like a spark that made things that are already happening worse. It showed how divided Americans were and brought out all these anxieties that had been bubbling under the surface.
It felt like the country split in half, with each side going further into their own beliefs.
Yeah.
The anger and distrust between the two sides was so intense.
One of the biggest and longest-lasting effects was that political polarization in the U.S. got even worse. Trump's win both made existing divisions deeper and created new ones. It really broke up the country's politics.
And we're still dealing with that today. It wasn't just disagreeing on policies anymore. It was like people started questioning each other's motives, their values, their whole understanding of reality.
Right.
It felt like nobody could have a normal conversation anymore.
Yeah, and this polarization wasn't just in politics. It spread into everyday life. Families, friendships, communities. People were unfriending each other online, avoiding family get-togethers, even ending relationships because of politics.
It's like the whole country was falling apart. And it's not clear if we can ever fully fix it.
Right.
Social media played a big part in making this polarization worse, creating echo chambers where people only saw information that agreed with them.
Absolutely. The way social media works often means that getting people engaged is more important than whether something is true. So misinformation spreads easily, and you end up in these filter bubbles where you never hear anything different.
Yeah.
This made it easier for conspiracy theories to take hold and made people trust the usual sources of information even less.
It was like everyone was living in a different world with their own version of reality.
Yeah.
No wonder it was so hard to communicate and find common ground.
Exactly.
But beyond the polarization, Trump's win also brought in this new wave of populism and nationalism, not just in America, but all over the world. His America First message connected with similar movements globally, giving a boost to leaders who had the same kind of nationalist, anti-globalist views.
Yeah, it was like this wave of populism was sweeping the globe, driven by economic anxieties, cultural anxieties, and a deep distrust of the establishment and elites.
And it's important to remember that populism isn't always a bad thing. It can be a force for change, giving a voice to people who are usually ignored, challenging the way things are. But it can also be used to spread division, undermine democracy,
Yeah.
and weaken the rule of law.
Exactly. We saw this happening in different ways, from the rise of far-right groups in Europe to the weakening of democratic institutions in countries like Hungary and Poland. It reminds us that democracy is fragile. We have to work hard to protect it.
Trump's presidency also had a huge impact on America's place in the world.
Yeah.
His America First policies pushed allies away, made enemies bolder,
Yeah.
and disrupted the international order that the U.S. had helped to create after World War II.
Right. He pulled out of international agreements, put tariffs in place, and often just acted alone without talking to or thinking about America's traditional partners. This was a big shift from how the U.S. had been doing things in foreign policy for a long time.
And this created a space in global leadership that other countries like China and Russia quickly filled. They started making new alliances, expanding their power, and reshaping the world in ways that are still challenging U.S. interests. So it wasn't just about American politics. It was about how those politics affected the whole world, changing the balance of power and making things more uncertain and dangerous.
Exactly. The effects of Trump's foreign policy are still being felt now, as the U.S. tries to figure out this new world where it's not the only superpower and where the global order is changing.
It feels like we're in a completely new era, one where the old rules don't work anymore and the future is much less clear.
That's a good way to describe it. And it highlights how much we need a different kind of leadership, one that can handle this new reality with intelligence planning and a commitment to working together and talking things out.
So we're back to this big question of leadership that we've been talking about throughout our deep dive, but now it feels even more important, even more urgent.
Definitely. The problems facing the U.S. and the world are more complicated than ever, and they're all connected. We need leaders who can think strategically, build agreement, and make people trust them, both at home and abroad.
As we wrap up this look at the 2016 election and what happened afterwards, I feel both worried and hopeful. Worried because of all the divisions and challenges we've talked about, but also hopeful because I think that by understanding these challenges, we can start to find solutions.
I agree. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the problems we're facing, but it's important to remember that we as citizens have a role to play in shaping the future.
We can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix things. We need to be active in our democracy, involved in our communities, and dedicated to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. And that starts with staying informed, thinking for ourselves, and talking to each other respectfully, even when it's hard. It's about holding our leaders accountable, but also recognizing that we each have a responsibility to make things better.
So this deep dive wasn't just about looking back. It was about understanding where we are now and preparing ourselves for the future. And I hope you're leaving today with a better understanding of what shaped the 2016 election and the challenges we still face as a nation.
I hope so too, because understanding the past is crucial for creating a better future. And that future depends on all of us being informed, engaged, and committed to the idea of democracy and working together for the common good.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of something important. Until then, stay curious, stay involved, and stay informed, and then if deep